Hi, today we're going to be modding a Sovol SV07 Plus printer and installing the Y-axis linear rail kit from TBStron3D. Linear rails replace the palm wheels in your printer, meaning you'll no longer need to deal with the eccentric nuts, which are used to tighten or loosen the palm wheels in your printer. Without palm wheels, you'll no longer have the bumps and waves that can show up in your bed meshes. Also, linear rails can potentially allow you to run your printer faster and get more reliable results. While in today's video, we'll be installing the Y-axis linear rail kit, we'll have a follow-up video to install the X-axis kit. Plus, we'll have additional videos as more mods are released for this printer. The Y-axis linear rail kit includes two 440mm long MGN 9C linear rails, each with two carriages. These are attached to the printer's base with two long brackets fastened with M4 by 8mm button head screws and M4 T-nuts. The linear rails are joined to the brackets with M3 by 5mm socket head screws. Two small brackets mount to the linear rail carriages with M3 by 8mm socket head screws and form the foundation for the printer's base plate, which is secured to the small brackets with M5 by 14mm button head screws and silicone gaskets. In addition to the linear rail kit, a number of tools and supplies are required. The first half of the supplies are used for cleaning and preparing the linear rails. These include isopropyl alcohol, or IPA, to clean out any existing grease, oil, or dirt that might be on the rails. A tall container is used for soaking the rails in the IPA, a timer, and grease to lubricate the rails. Twist ties will be used to prevent the carriages from sliding off the linear rails until they are ready to be installed. A blunt tip syringe will be used to apply the grease, and a lint-free cloth will help clean up any excess that works its way out of the carriages. You might want to wear disposable gloves to keep your hands clean and to prevent them from drying out because of the IPA. And finally, you'll probably need a lot of paper towels for cleanup. The rest of the supplies include a Phillips head screwdriver, an 8mm socket, 2.5, 3, and 4mm hex wrenches, masking tape, 3 small pieces of paper, and a pen. Additionally, you'll want to find a thick piece of corrugated cardboard that is roughly 20mm wide and 30mm long, although the exact dimensions are not that important. This cardboard will make reinstalling the printer's bed easier and reduce the chance the bed's insulation gets damaged. While not required, I like to use a set of 3D printed inserts when mounting the printer's base plate to the small brackets. A link to the inserts is in the video's description. Finally, we'll be using a 10mm long standoff and an M3 by 16mm socket head screw to replace the existing Y-axis end stop. We had to provide them since we are installing a pre-release version of the linear rail kit, but your kit should already include them. Before we can begin installing the linear rails, they need to be properly prepared. Being a dynamic, mechanical part, linear rails require lubrication and proper maintenance to ensure long-lasting performance. However, few linear rails, including even high-quality linear rails, come with the required lubrication needed to minimize friction and wear. Instead, they're often shipped with a light coating of oil, only suited for rust prevention. There are many reasons for this, but the primary is that the optimal lubricant depends on how the linear rails will be used, what mechanical loads are going to be applied, the velocity of the carriage, and if an automatic or continuous lubrication system will be used. Since there's no way for the manufacturer to know how a particular linear rail will be used, they leave it up to the user to apply the final lubrication. While there are many different options to choose from, today we're going to be using Moblix EP1. This is a general-purpose industrial grease frequently used with linear rails and other motion systems. Mobilix EP1 can easily be found online and at industrial supply houses, but might be unavailable at your local hardware store. You don't have to use this particular brand or variety of grease, however. When choosing a grease, it's important to look at its NLGI consistency number, which is a standardized measure of the hardness of a grease. This standard was established by the National Lubricating Grease Institute and reproduced in independent ASTM, ASE, and ISO standards. There are 9 different grades, or NLGI numbers, in the standard, starting with 000, the softest, then 00, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and finally the hardest, 6. Using a lubricant with the correct NLGI value is important because if the grease is too stiff, then the grease might not flow into the areas needing lubrication. But if the grease is too soft, it might leak out of the bearing or wash away if water is present. NLGI 0 through NLGI 2 are often recommended for linear rails using consumer-grade 3D printers. But given the relatively low loads and forces in a 3D printer, any grease within that range should probably work. Mobilix EP1 is an NLGI 1 grease. In the past, we've also used Superlube 21030 to lubricate linear rails. Superlube is also a general-purpose grease that is generally easier to find than Mobilix EP1, but it has an NLGI 2 classification. While we've never had any performance issues with Superlube, the harder consistency can make applying the grease a little more difficult. Also, this particular variety of grease contains syncolin, a form of PTFE. There are mixed opinions regarding the benefits and drawbacks of PTFE and other additives in the grease used for linear rails. The first step when preparing the linear rails is to protect these carriages because they're filled with a large number of tiny ball bearings. And if the carriage ever came off the end of the rail, those ball bearings would go everywhere. And even if you could find all of them, it's very difficult to get them back into the carriage and then the carriage back onto the rail. And to make it even more difficult, some linear rails have the ball bearings in a special order. And if you don't reproduce that, then the bearing might not work properly. So to prevent that, we're going to use twist ties. And we just simply attach a twist tie to each end of each linear rail. And while cheap and simple, it's an effective way to prevent the carriage from being able to fall off the end of the rail. Now, some linear rails do come with these little black stoppers that sort of serve the same purpose, except sometimes they have a tendency to fall out. So I recommend, even if your linear rails do have these stoppers, that you also add the twist ties just to be extra safe. Now that our linear rails have twist ties on them, it's time to move to the next step, which is removing any existing oil or grease that might be on the linear rails or inside the carriages. To do this, we're going to soak them for about 30 minutes in isopropyl alcohol. This is important because any oil or grease that might already be on the linear rails could interact with the new grease that we need to apply, reducing its effectiveness and potentially even causing it to break down. So what we're going to do is move the carriages to the bottom of the linear rails and then place them in a tall container. I'm using this wire to hold up the linear rails because otherwise this container would fall over. So we do the same thing with the second linear rail. And now, while isopropyl alcohol is fairly safe, it does have a tendency to dry out your skin, so you might want to use disposable gloves. So now we're going to take the isopropyl alcohol and fill the container so the carriages are completely submerged. You probably want to give it an extra inch or two just to be safe. And then we can start our timer. So we set it to 30 minutes. And we can start it. Now, while you're waiting, make sure to every, say, 2-3 minutes, take the rails and move the carriages just a little bit to ensure that the isopropyl alcohol gets into all the little spaces between the bearings so we can remove as much oil and grease as possible. Now that our 30 minutes are up, we can take the linear rails out to let them dry. But we're also going to want to clean the portion of the linear rail which was not submerged in the isopropyl alcohol to make sure we get as much grease and oil off these rails as possible. And while you can use paper towels, I prefer to use a lint-free cloth to make sure we don't get little paper towel bits inside the holes. Now, when you're working with this much IPA, the smell can be a little overwhelming, so you might want to make sure your room has good ventilation, or at least move the IPA away from you while you're working with it. So now that our linear rails are clean, we'll just set them aside for a little while so that they can dry, and then we can apply the new grease. It's been a little while now, and the linear rails are dry, meaning it's finally time to install the grease. The linear rails that came in the kit we are installing today are Highwind brand, but the linear rails in your kit might be from a slightly different brand. While linear rails might seem relatively simple, just being a small metal block that slides along an hourglass-shaped rail, they actually are relatively complex and have a large number of small ball bearings that travel through very precise channels to reduce the friction, allowing the carriage to travel up and down the rail without having any wiggle. And it's these channels where we have to apply the grease and make sure that the grease covers all of the ball bearings. Luckily, Highwind rails have lubrication ports on each side of each of the carriages, making it easier to inject the grease into the channels of the carriage. The way you would normally do that is to use a syringe. You're going to want a tip that is as large as possible that still fits into the lubrication port. And you're going to want to squeeze lightly on the syringe while you're slowly moving the carriage. This is going to force the grease through the channels. And you're going to want to do this until the grease is at least past the halfway point of the carriage, and then work from the other side. So now let's apply the grease to the first carriage. So we take the syringe and we insert it into the lubrication port. And now we're going to very slowly move the carriage while we're applying even pressure to the syringe. Once we think we're about halfway past, we can look at the back and we're well past. So let's try from the other side. And we can look, and we've got lubrication on the entirety of the channel. So let's roll it back and forth to make sure that the lubrication gets throughout the entire channel. Let's add a little bit more to ensure that we have lubrication through the entire block. And now let's start on the second one. And the third one. And finally the fourth one. And now we've got lubrication in all 4 of the carriage blocks. If your linear rail kit includes non-Highwind brand rails, you might not have lubrication ports on the sides of your carriages. So you'll need to apply the grease in a slightly different manner. As an example, this linear rail doesn't have lubrication ports. So to apply grease to this, we'll first place it upside down, and then we'll take a much larger syringe and we'll place the tip over a hole in the linear rail and position it about the midpoint of the carriage, and we'll apply the grease while we slowly move the rail. You might need to move the carriage back and forth quite a bit to be able to spread the grease out, and you might need to apply grease a few times. There are 2 main drawbacks to needing to apply grease in this fashion. First, it tends to be a bit messier, so cleanup is a little bit harder. But also, after the rail has been installed, you no longer have access to the back of the carriage, so you can't apply new grease during maintenance. The final step in preparing the rails is cleanup. We need to get any of the excess grease out of the carriages, and then to remove the grease that's oozed onto the rails. So let's start by just wiping off the grease. And we need to move the carriages back and forth to force the grease out of the carriages. You're going to want to keep moving the carriages back and forth until grease stops coming out. Okay, we work on this one. Get all this grease, picking this up. Try to avoid getting grease into the threaded holes. We need to move the carriages back and forth quite a bit. And we get the grease out. This might require quite a few paper towels. And then if you get any grease stuck in the mounting holes, Q-tips tend to be very helpful. And now that we have most of the grease out of the carriages and there's none on the rails, our rails are now prepared. Step 1. Move the gantry most of the way up. Step 2. Shut down clipper to prevent data corruption. Step 3. Turn off power. Step 4. Disconnect power for safety. Step 5. Remove the build surface. Step 6. Remove the adjustment knobs and screws using a Phillips head screwdriver. Step 7. Move the bed out of the way. Step 8. Remove the bed springs. Step 9. Loosen the Y-axis belt. Step 10. Disconnect the Y-axis belt. Step 11. Remove the Y-axis belt tensioner using a 2.5mm hex wrench. Step 12. Remove the tool tray. Step 13. Remove the front plastic using a 4mm hex wrench. Step 14. Remove the base plate. Step 15. Remove palm wheel hardware using an 8mm socket and a 3mm hex wrench. Step 16. Install screws and T-nuts into the long brackets. Use 14 M4 by 8 mm screws, 14 M4 T-nuts, and a 2.5 mm hex wrench. Keep the screws as loose as possible to make installing the brackets easier. Step 17. Install the long brackets using a 2.5 mm hex wrench. The brackets need to be 6.25 millimeters from the front of the printer. Make sure the brackets are not further away, or the carriages might run off the ends of the rails once everything is fully installed. Step 18. Use masking tape, pen, and paper to mark the linear rail mounting holes. This will make installing the linear rails easier. Step 19. Install the linear rails using 20 M3 by 5 mm screws and a 2.5 mm hex wrench. Make sure the arrows on the linear rails are pointing inwards and keep the linear rails very loose. They will be tightened in a later step. Step 20. Install the small brackets using a 2.5 mm hex wrench and 16 M3 by 8 mm screws. Ensure the screws are evenly tightened by using an hourglass pattern and multiple passes. Step 21. Install the silicone gaskets. Step 22. Reinstall the base plate using 6 M5 by 14 mm screws, a 3 mm hex wrench, and 3 3D printed spacers. Ensure all 6 screws are evenly tightened. Step 23. Tighten the linear rails using a 2.5 mm hex wrench. To ensure the linear rails are correctly positioned, slowly move the base plate back and forth and verify smooth travel. Step 24. Replace the existing Y-axis end stop with the 3D printed standoff using the M3 by 16 mm socket head screw and a 2.5 mm hex wrench. Step 25. Reinstall the front plastic using a 4 mm hex wrench and 4 previously removed screws. Step 26. Reinstall the belt tensioner using a 2.5mm hex wrench. Make sure the belt is not twisted inside the printer and that the belt is through the bearing correctly. Step 27. Reattach the Y-axis belt. Step 28. Tighten the Y-axis belt. Step 29. Return the bed so the adjustment hardware can be reinstalled. Use a piece of cardboard to prevent the bed's insulation from getting damaged. Step 30. Reinstall the adjustment springs, screws, and knobs using a Phillips head screwdriver. Step 31. Return the tool tray. Step 32. Return the build surface, making sure it is aligned properly. Step 33. Reconnect the power cable. That was the last step in installing the Y-axis linear rail kit in our Sovol SV07 Plus printer. If you've been following along but you've encountered any problems or issues, let us know in the comments below and we'll do our best to try to help you out. Also, we plan on having follow-up videos to install the X-axis linear rail kit and any other kits as they become available. Now, if you've made it this far and you found the video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe because it really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to be a super supporter of Bed Leveler 5000 or us, come join us over at Patreon. Thanks for watching.